It happens more often than we would like. We're there in the middle of a meeting, a family conversation, or even in an everyday situation, and something inside us starts to feel uneasy, not because we raised our voice or were rude. On the contrary, we spoke carefully, chose our arguments with attention, maintained a respectful tone, but still, we feel with almost painful clarity that we're not truly being heard. It's as if our words pass through a thick glass behind which no one is really paying attention. And in that moment, many of us feel the temptation to raise our voice, to shout to be heard, to harden ourselves to be respected. But what almost always happens is that when the volume goes up, the listening goes down, and the respect we so desperately seek doesn't come from shouting. It comes from presence, a presence that doesn't need to impose itself because it is already complete in itself, a presence that knows its own worth, and because of that knows when and how to say what needs to be said, with serene firmness. It's not about staying silent. It's about choosing words consciously as someone who cares for their own integrity while also caring for the connection with the other. Have you ever felt this way? Have you had that sensation that no matter how much you explain, no matter how hard you try to be clear and kind, there's still a resistance, a subtle barrier that prevents true dialogue? And what do you do then? Do you insist? Try one more time, harden yourself, withdraw? Do you swallow the discomfort? Perhaps the most important question here isn't what to say, but what kind of presence you wish to embody in your relationships, one that demands respect through restraint, or one that inspires respect from serenity. There's a phrase that, when said with clarity and without confrontation, has the power to change the tone of a conversation without the need for conflict. I understand your point, but I don't agree. It seems simple, and it is, but in its simplicity lies a depth that often escapes us. Because what we're doing there isn't just expressing an opinion, it's affirming our autonomy of thought while acknowledging the other with respect. It's saying, I hear you, I see where you're coming from, but I don't walk the same path. And that's not an offense, it's an act of maturity. In times when the pressure for agreement can be subtle or explicit, holding a difference with serenity is a powerful gesture. It's easy to give in just to avoid tension. What's difficult is to stand firm without needing to hurt. But it's precisely in that difficulty that our emotional identity is strengthened. In work settings, this phrase can be an essential tool when someone proposes something that doesn't make sense to you, or when group pressure tries to force an approval that doesn't feel genuine. Also at home, when you're expected to accept certain ideas just out of respect or habit, saying, I understand but I don't agree, is setting a boundary without violence. And that kind of boundary, said calmly, often disarms the other's defensive impulse, because we're not attacking, we're affirming, without justifying immediately, without over-embellishing, just holding with dignity that our way of seeing things is different. Have you ever allowed yourself that kind of firmness? What would it be like to express it without feeling guilt or the need to explain every detail? Perhaps the most liberating thing isn't convincing the other, but stopping the need to justify not agreeing. There are moments when the conversation isn't just about what is said, but how it's said. And sometimes the how becomes a subtle, almost invisible violence. Constant interruptions, raised tones, veiled accusations, an aggressive haste that leaves no room for thought. In those moments, One of the most powerful and hardest phrases to hold is, "Let's talk when we can do so with respect." It's not a slam door. It's not a punishment. It's a necessary pause, an adult way of saying, "This way I won't continue." Because speaking under pressure isn't conversing, it's defending oneself. And not everything deserves that energy. This phrase marks a before and after. It's like putting a new frame around the picture, one that demands dignity for the exchange to continue. It doesn't require the other to change their point of view, but it does care for the manner, because respect isn't an emotional luxury. It's a minimum requirement for words to have meaning. And when that respect breaks, you don't respond in kind. You don't raise your tone to balance the scales. You breathe, you look straight ahead, and you name the boundary. We can't continue like this, but we can when respect is present again. Some don't understand this pause. They read it as coldness, distance, or even manipulation. But the truth is, there's nothing braver than knowing how to stop an interaction that's draining us without needing to shout, without needing to hurt. Just saying, "I won't keep talking if it means losing myself in the process." And you, how many times have you continued conversations that were no longer conversations, just out of fear of seeming weak or abrupt? How many times did you need this phrase and didn't dare say it? Perhaps now, with an internal pause, you can begin to do so. There are discussions that aren't really discussions. They're labyrinths, cycles that repeat over and over with no visible exit. Veiled accusations, old grievances resurfacing, disguised as new arguments, attempts at provocation hidden behind innocent questions. And you realize in the midst of it all that you're losing more than time. You're losing vital energy, calm, focus, dignity. And then a phrase appears, simple yet representing a profound shift. "I prefer not to continue this conversation, not as a threat, not as punishment, but as an act of silent yet resolute emotional self-defense." It's the moment when you decide not to keep fueling a dialogue that's become exhausting. This phrase doesn't aim to win the discussion. On the contrary, it abandons the battlefield, not because you can't fight, but because you choose not to, because some battles only leave us empty, even if we think we've had the last word. Knowing how to close a conversation with respect, without slamming doors or labeling, is an art and requires courage. Because we're so used to explaining, justifying, defending every decision that saying, "I won't continue," can feel, even to ourselves, like surrender. But it's not. It's often the first step toward genuine care for our peace. In family, with friends, with colleagues. We've all been in situations where there's no longer openness, only insistence, where there's no listening, only an urgency to be right. And though we want to resolve, clarify, save the connection, sometimes the wisest thing is to step out of the loop, hold silence, withdraw in time, because continuing isn't always synonymous with maturity. Sometimes maturity lies precisely in knowing when to stop. Can you imagine what would happen if, the next time you're caught in that kind of exchange, you allowed yourself to say, "I prefer not to continue this conversation"? How much energy would you recover if you stopped arguing and started protecting your core? In many conversations, especially those that touch the deepest parts, values, beliefs, personal decisions, a tension appears that isn't always named, but is felt with clarity. The other doesn't just want to express their point of view. They want you to share it, to validate it, to embrace it as your own. And when you don't, the uncomfortable silence emerges, the judgmental look, the insistent question, how can you think that way? In those moments, one phrase can act as a firm but courteous shield. That's your opinion. I respect it, but I don't share it. And by saying it, you're not closing the dialogue. You're opening a space where difference can exist without becoming a threat. Respecting an opinion doesn't mean adopting it. It doesn't mean giving in to emotional pressure. It means acknowledging that the other has the right to think differently, and so do you. It's a fine but powerful line. In many settings, especially with close relationships, holding this difference feels like betrayal, like a crack, but it's not. It's identity. It's saying, I can love you without agreeing with you. I can value you even when I don't join your perspective. This stance doesn't seek conflict, but it doesn't avoid it at all costs either. It doesn't evade. It stays calm in its own perspective. Using this phrase doesn't require harshness. It requires naturalness. Because when it's said with a relaxed body, a serene voice, without a challenging tone, it diffuses the impulse to impose. It lowers the temperature of the debate and, at the same time, strengthens self-esteem. Because you see yourself holding your truth without needing to turn it into universal law. Think about the times you nodded to avoid tension when you actually thought differently, or the times you argued for hours just to try to defend a stance the other wasn't willing to consider. What if, instead of all that, you could simply say, I respect it, but I don't share it? How much relief would fit in that intermediate space where you no longer need to fight, but you don't need to surrender either? When we start practicing these phrases, something inside us changes, not immediately, not like a magic formula, but slowly, word by word, we notice that our place in conversations begins to transform. It's no longer just about defending ourselves or avoiding conflict. It's about inhabiting our relationships with more clarity, more serenity, and more emotional responsibility. Because saying, I don't share your opinion, or I prefer not to continue this conversation, or let's talk with respect, aren't strategies to win arguments. They're gestures of an adult presence, a presence that doesn't need to shout, convince, or flee, a presence that knows it's enough, that's whole, even in the midst of tension. And when that happens, something shifts in others too. Sometimes they're disconcerted, sometimes they're upset, but other times they open up because they're not being attacked. They don't feel judged. They're simply facing, perhaps for the first time, someone who sets boundaries with firmness, without violence. And that, though it may unsettle at first, leaves a mark over time. It teaches, it invites another way of relating, one where respect isn't demanded with shouts, but offered in every gesture, in the way we listen, in the tone we respond with, in the moment we choose to stay silent, not out of omission, but out of dignity. These phrases don't change the world, but they change how we position ourselves within it. They change how we see ourselves after a difficult conversation, because we start to recognize ourselves as more whole, less reactive, more present. And over time, we also begin to attract relationships that operate on that same frequency. People who don't need to impose themselves, who know how to pause, who know how to listen, who understand that respect doesn't mean agreement, and that disagreement isn't a threat, but an adult way of being in the world. And you How do you imagine your life would be if you could approach your dialogues from that place of inner calm without giving up your voice and without overpowering the others? At this point, you may have noticed that we're not just talking about phrases. We're talking about an internal language that's cultivated over time, a language that doesn't need embellishments or long speeches, that doesn't resort to sarcasm, irony, or shouting, a language that comes from the respect we have for ourselves and extends to how we communicate with the world. Because at the end of the day, the way we speak says much more about us than what we say. And when our words align with our calm, our clarity, our dignity, something settles in the conversation. There's no longer a struggle, there's presence. These 5 phrases we've explored aren't formulas. They're tools of emotional maturity, resources for moments when we feel respect slipping away, when the conversation is warping, when our energy is going in a direction we don't want to follow. Having them at hand is, in some way, a reminder that not every dialogue deserves to be continued, that not every provocation deserves a response, and that silence, when chosen consciously, also communicates, sometimes even more than words. Perhaps the most important thing these phrases teach us isn't how to speak with others, but how to speak to ourselves, how to tell ourselves internally, I don't need to convince, I don't need to please, I don't need to impose, I just need to be at peace with who I am, with what I think, and with how I choose to express it. From there, respect isn't demanded, it's inspired, it isn't claimed, it's exercised. And when you stand in that place, something subtle but powerful begins to change. It's no longer about being right. It's about having peace, about choosing when to continue and when to stop, about knowing that not every connection is worth sustaining at any cost, that sometimes the most loving act we can do is to say enough, without shouting, without dramatizing, just with a quiet firmness that over time becomes the hallmark of those who learn to respect themselves first. Are you willing to cultivate that way of being, where your voice doesn't impose itself, but also doesn't dissolve? Can you imagine what it would be like to live more days where respect isn't a struggle, but a natural consequence of your presence? Something changes, and it's not immediate, but it's profound when we begin to communicate from this place of quiet firmness. It doesn't just change how we speak. It silently changes how we're perceived, and consequently, how people respond to us. Because at first, it may seem like a small gesture to say, I don't agree, without justifying, or to respectfully interrupt a conversation that's crossing boundaries. But behind that gesture is a complete reconfiguration of how we relate, and that doesn't go unnoticed. Those who were used to a more compliant version of us, the version that endured, that gave in, that stayed silent, may react with confusion, annoyance, or even resistance, because every true transformation first unsettles those who, even unconsciously, benefited from our old way of being. And that's where the practice becomes more demanding, when we're no longer just facing uncomfortable situations, but also the emotional consequences of changing the place we occupied in relationships. Saying, this doesn't seem appropriate to me, in the middle of a sexist joke, a humiliating comment, or a criticism disguised as concern, isn't just setting a boundary. It's declaring that we're no longer available to sustain dynamics that hurt us, that we won't normalize what leaves us in uncomfortable silence, that the connection can continue, yes, but only if it's reconfigured on a more dignified basis, and that, though it may hurt at first, paves the way toward a more mature, more conscious coexistence, even if not everyone chooses to walk it with us. And it's there where a question often arises that we don't always dare to face head on. What connections are sustained only because we've tolerated more than we should? What relationships have become habit but require us to deny ourselves a little each day to maintain them? It's not about cutting ties impulsively. It's about allowing ourselves to choose again from a different place, a place where it's no longer necessary to endure, to be loved, or to smile while something in our chest tightens, a place where we can say without drama but with firmness, not like this, and from there observe what happens, who listens, who approaches with a different tone, who leaves, and also who stays and learns to speak with us from this new version that no longer gives itself away to please but offers itself from dignity. There's an internal transformation that happens almost silently when we start speaking from this new place. It's not immediate, it's not loud, and often it's not noticeable from the outside at first, but we feel it. It's a change in the texture of our own voice, in how our words align with what we truly think, with what we feel, and with what we're no longer willing to silence. Because speaking from quiet firmness doesn't just change our relationships, it changes how we perceive ourselves. And that, when it happens, can be profoundly healing. For years, many people learn to speak from a place that isn't their own. They speak from duty, from habit, from the need to not upset. They express themselves, measuring the effect of every word as if walking through an emotional minefield. And in that constant exercise of adjustment, the voice begins to get lost. Not the physical voice, but the other one, the internal one. The one that says what we truly think, but so often censor to avoid consequences, because we want to maintain harmony, because we fear disappointing, because we believe being loved means saying what the other expects to hear. And then, when we suddenly dare to say a clear phrase without embellishments, without needing to convince, without asking permission, something aligns inside, as if we finally meet a part of ourselves that had been waiting to be recognized. It's a strange sensation at first. There may be guilt, there may be doubt, there may be fear, but there's also relief, because recognizing ourselves in our own voice is one of the most intimate acts of emotional freedom. It's remembering that we don't need to distort ourselves to be worthy of being in a connection, that there's no need to be accepted at the cost of fragmenting ourselves. Recovering our voice isn't a single event. It's a process, a return, and it often begins with something small, a phrase we would have avoided before, and now allow ourselves to say, not with violence, not with arrogance, but with clarity, with respect, not with the certainty that there's no real respect for the other if there isn't first a deep respect for ourselves. Because even when we stay silent to avoid hurting, even when we choose not to respond, that silence can be charged with presence, with consciousness, with decision. That's why it's worth asking ourselves, where am I speaking from? Is this voice I use to relate mine, or is it a softened, adapted version designed to sustain connections that perhaps no longer sustain me? Recovering the voice isn't about speaking more. It's about speaking from a more authentic, truer place. And when you achieve that, you don't need to shout to be heard. There's a very persistent idea that without realizing it, many of us have carried for years, a belief that's almost innocent but deeply frustrating when reality doesn't uphold it. The idea that if we speak with respect, clarity, and empathy, the other will respond in kind. That if I make an effort to be fair, careful, honest, then the other will be too. That if I'm reasonable, they'll listen to me. That if I don't attack, they won't attack me. That if I care for my words, I'll be understood. And when that doesn't happen, when the other responds with irony, judgment, or stubbornness, we feel a mix of surprise, pain, and powerlessness because we did everything right and still it didn't work. It's important to say it clearly. Speaking from maturity doesn't guarantee the same level of maturity on the other side. Speaking with respect doesn't obligate anyone to respect us. Being clear doesn't ensure understanding. This isn't a law of cause and effect. It's not a transaction. It's an ethical choice. We choose to communicate this way, not because it ensures results, but because it's consistent with who we want to be in the world, because it's the way we choose to inhabit relationships, even when the environment doesn't support it, even when there's no immediate reward, even when we're not understood. And this isn't easy to accept, because we'd like to believe that our clarity will transform, that our self-control will inspire, that our measured tone will invite dialogue. And sometimes it does happen. Sometimes the other pauses, realizes, reflects, but other times it doesn't. Other times the other stays in the same defensive, hurtful, impenetrable place. And that's where our decision is tested. Will I keep engaging in this exchange at any cost? Will I keep trying to make myself understood? Or will I recognize that there's a point where my part is done? Saying, I've done my part, isn't a way of giving up. It's a way of setting the boundary where our responsibility ends. Because while we can't control how the other listens, we can choose where we speak from. And that's no small thing. It's a profound act of dignity, a way of protecting ourselves from emotional exhaustion, from trying to open a door that the other side doesn't want to open. And perhaps that's the hardest part of all. Accepting that clarity isn't always enough, that there are people who aren't ready for genuine dialogue, who don't have the emotional resources to sustain a disagreement without turning it into conflict, and that it's not our job to educate them, reform them, or convince them. Our task is more humble and more powerful, to stay coherent even when the environment doesn't offer it. Can you accept that you can't transform the other's reaction, but you can decide how you position yourself in front of it? Over time, you discover that not everything needs a response, that sometimes silence is the firmest way to set a boundary, not from evasion, but from presence. There are conversations that only continue because we keep feeding them. And when we decide not to continue, not to argue, not to justify, something unravels. The conflict loses oxygen. The word, when it becomes a choice and not a reflex, takes on a different weight. And the silence that once felt heavy becomes a refuge. Sometimes the most respectful act isn't to speak more. It's to know when to stop speaking.